Ukrainian Rangers and parachute brigades announced a breakthrough in the western suburbs of Bakhmut. During a press conference at the Kyiv Press Center on Friday morning, Ukraine's Defense Ministry spokesman Brigadier General Alexei Hromov said fierce fighting was still ongoing in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Some Ukrainian units say they have made progress in the western suburbs of the city. Specifically, Ukraine's 3rd Ranger Brigade said its recent offensive actions had helped Ukrainian defenders gain strong positions ahead of the expected Ukrainian counterattack. Brigade leaders said the breakthrough occurred in an area about 2,000 meters wide and 700 meters deep. In 24 hours on Thursday, Ukraine's 3rd Ranger Brigade eliminated 50 Russian paratroopers, wounded 100 others and took 4 prisoners alive, including a battalion commander. The brigade says this has significantly reduced enemy capabilities in the area. Regarding other recent developments in Bakhmut, Brigadier General Alexei Hromov said Ukrainian forces have made advances in several areas around the city in recent days, despite being defeated by the Russian army. Fierce attack. Ukrainian fighters from another unit, the 46th Airborne Brigade, said they were focusing on a promising territory in the countryside south of the city, as well as villages near the main highway running back northwest from Bakhmut to Sloviansk. The head of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, on Thursday complained to Russia's Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu that Russian military units had suddenly withdrawn in an area north of Bakhmut, exposing his warriors. However, Prigozhin said his fighters in the city continued to attack the streets and buildings along the western edge of Bakhmut. 2. Zelensky says assault brigades are preparing, but gives no details. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a meeting with senior commanders on Thursday, later hinting that his army's assault brigades were preparing for a general counteroffensive, but gave no details. Specifically, "The assault brigades are doing well, we are preparing, but there are no details," Zelensky said. Ukraine has made significant gains along the front lines of the conflict in recent days, fueling speculation that its much-anticipated counteroffensive may be already underway. A senior U.S. official told CNN that shaping operations began last week, but Ukraine has yet to explicitly state that its counteroffensive has officially begun. After days of heavy Russian missile attacks on Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine, Zelensky said his military would prioritize strengthening air defenses and missile depots, training troops, and buy more ranged weapons. Zelensky also made statements commemorating the day that Stalin expelled the Tatars from Crimea in 1944. "We honor the memory of all the victims of the deportation of the Tatars in Crimea," the Ukrainian leader said in his nightly address. "It was one of the most serious crimes of the 20th century. An entire nation was forced out of its homeland and forced to live in a foreign land for decades. And when people returned home, Russia once again brought evil to their homes." 3. The General Staff of Ukraine denies Russia's claim that it has hit its arsenals and ammunition stores. Moscow announced on Thursday that it had hit warehouses of foreign-made weapons and equipment during Wednesday night's attacks on Ukraine with high-precision missiles. Last night, the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out group attacks with long-range high-precision weapons, at sea and in the air, said Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov, spokesman for the Russian Defense Ministry. Targets large stockpiles of foreign-made weapons and equipment, as well as enemy reserves. The goal has been achieved. All designated targets were hit. As a result of the airstrikes, a significant amount of weapons and ammunition of the armed forces of Ukraine was destroyed, and the advance of reserve troops to the war zones was also prevented. According to the spokesman of the Ukrainian Air Force, Colonel Yuri Ianat, from 2100 hours on May 17 to 5:30 on May 18, the Russian invaders launched multiple missile attacks from all directions. A total of 30 sea, air, and land cruise missiles were launched. 22 Kh-101 and Kh-555 cruise missiles were fired from strategic aircraft, 2 Tu-160s and 8 Tu-95s. 6-caliber cruise missiles were fired from warships in the Black Sea. In addition, 2 Iskander cruise missiles were launched from ground-based tactical missile systems, said Colonel Yuri Ianat, noting that air defense forces and the Air Force cooperate with other ministries. Another part of the Ukrainian self-defense forces destroyed 29 cruise missiles. The other missile is believed to have hit a civilian position outside Kyiv. 4th, the UK Ministry of Defence said that Ukraine has successfully used the Storm Shadow missile provided by the UK. Ukraine used a UK-supplied Storm Shadow missile against Russian forces, the UK's defence minister said on Thursday. All I can confirm is that the Storm Shadow missile was successfully used. That's the information I got from the Ukrainians, and I'm glad it helped them defend their country, the ministry said. British Defence Minister Ben Wallace told reporters. The Storm Shadow missiles, the longest-range weapon in Ukraine's arsenal, have just been delivered to Kyiv ahead of an anticipated counterattack against the Russian military. This long-range cruise missile is stealthy and has a range of more than 250 kilometers, or 155 miles. These missiles have a range that reaches deep into Russian-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine. A Western official told CNN that the UK has received assurances from the Ukrainian government that these missiles will only be used within Ukraine's sovereign territory and not inside Russia. Ben Wallace called the UK donation the best chance for Ukraine to defend itself against continued Russian brutality. The civil military administrations set up by Russia in the Luhansk People's Republic and the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic have been reporting Ukrainian shelling of artillery and missile depots for nearly a week. These sites have never been attacked before because they are out of range of HIMARS. Asked about a potential counteroffensive and Ukraine's attempt to retake Crimea from Russia, Mr. Wallace said that under international law, Ukraine has every right to do it in self-defense. It's their sovereign territory, he said. Like you asked me if the United States would choose to take back parts of Texas from the enemy that invaded it. You will need to consult anyone else from abroad about what you can and cannot get back. That is Ukrainian land, it is their sovereign territory, it has been invaded, they have lost thousands of lives because of that invasion, and I think in the end it will be Ukraine's decision. The UK will not stand in the way of that, he added. Over the past few days, Russia has continued to attack Ukraine with rockets, killing one civilian and wounding two others in Odessa overnight. However, Ukraine maintains that it was able to shoot down many Russian missiles before they reached their target, especially in the capital Kyiv. On Tuesday morning, Russia launched what Ukraine described as a special attack on Kyiv in which all missiles were intercepted by air defenses. As the battle raged, there was confusion as to whether the Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun, although it may have been Ukraine's own will to conceal its general counteroffensive plan. Equipment supplied by the United States and NATO continues to pour into the country, and Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said on Thursday that the international community's support for Ukraine is growing stronger. 5. The Russian governor accused Ukraine of cross-border attacks that killed two civilians. The governor of Russia's Belgorod region said that two civilians were killed by Ukrainian fire in a district near the border. Vyacheslav Gladkov said two people were killed and one was hospitalized in a critical condition in the Shebekinsky district. Gladkov said, Ukrainian armed forces killed these civilians while they were in the vegetable garden growing potatoes. Several Russian civilians have been killed or injured in areas near the border since Russia invaded Ukraine last year. Gladkov said on May 10, a man in the Belgorod region was killed after being wounded in the head by shelling from Ukraine. In Ukraine, Ola Sinyhubov, head of the Kharkiv regional military government, said on Thursday that one person was killed in the village of Tsirkany due to a Russian missile attack. He said two more civilians were injured. Ukraine says its northern border areas are under attack by Russian forces almost daily, resulting in dozens of casualties in recent months. 6. The U.S. discovered an accounting error, giving Ukraine an additional $3 billion in support for military aid. The Biden administration made an accounting error in assessing the value of military assistance the United States has given Ukraine to date, which freed up about $3 billion more in aid, many congressional and administration officials said. Told CNN. Defense officials explained that the accounting error occurred because when the U.S. transferred weapons to Ukraine, they used the replacement value instead of the actual weapons value. That increases the cost of each package, since new weapons are more expensive than old ones, and leads to the false assumption that much of the funding has been spent. The error, which was communicated to lawmakers and congressional staff on Thursday, caused frustration from members of the House Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee. They believe the mistake reduced the amount of U.S. support to Ukraine that led to the counterattack. The discovery of a $3 billion accounting error discovered 2 months ago and shared only today with Congress is extremely problematic, to say the least. These funds could have been used to provide additional supplies and weapons for the upcoming counterattack, rather than allocating funds to sustain the remainder of the fiscal year, said Michael McCaul, President. House Foreign Affairs Committee and Mike Rogers, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Service Commission, wrote in a statement Thursday. McCall and Rogers say the administration should make up for this lost precious time by using these funds to immediately supply Ukraine with the DPICMS and ATACMS missiles it needs to advance its counterattack and win the war. Kim Twee would like to open brackets to explain that DPICMS is an air-to-ground missile. It explodes in the air, and when it explodes it creates a cluster of small projectiles that cover a larger area. ATACMS is a guided missile with a range of up to 300 kilometers. The Pentagon previously said there was just over $2.3 billion left for the Presidential Withdrawal Agency for Ukraine. Now, as a result of this disclosure, there is still about $5.3 billion, more than the largest package offered to Ukraine. The new money will likely mitigate the need for Congress to pass additional support before the end of the fiscal year in September. 7. Former U.S. ambassador commented that Putin has failed miserably in his efforts to save the Ukraine war. Newsweek had an article titled "Putin has failed miserably to try to salvage Ukraine war." Ex-ambassador, which means former U.S. ambassador, commented that Putin has failed miserably in his rescue efforts. The war in Ukraine. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through the presentation of Thai Van. John Herbst, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, told Newsweek that Russian President Vladimir Putin had failed miserably in his war against Ukraine. Herbst, senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasian Center, reflected on Putin's all-out invasion of Ukraine launched nearly 15 months ago and said, "Putin has had a very bad year." Bad. The Kremlin sought to turn the Russian invasion into a special military operation against Ukraine and a battle for Russia's survival. In March, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that a foreign policy strategy recently adopted by Putin identifies the West as a threat to Russia's existence. Herbst said the Russian leader has tried to convince the Russian people that war exists, but with little success. Putin has failed miserably, the former diplomat said, pointing to public discussion of the war from Russian military bloggers and websites that often publish Kremlin propaganda. Herbst said he saw a post last week that said Russia would perform better in the war if the people truly believed the war was a fight of survival for the country. Interestingly, they didn't believe it because it was an absurd idea. It's a war of survival for Ukraine, that's why they are fighting bravely. For Russia, it is Putin's own choice of war, Herbst said. Just weeks after Putin's all-out invasion, in March 2022, Herbst told Newsweek that the war was an irreparable disaster for the Russian president. The former ambassador said on Tuesday that Putin's clear failure in Ukraine was causing significant and growing stress on his regime. A year ago, Putin lost the battle in Kyiv and the battle in Kharkiv. But his forces have regrouped and are making slow but noticeable progress in the Donbass in April-May 2022. In June, Ukraine received HIMARS from us, and by August they began to counterattack, recapturing more than 50% of the land that Moscow has occupied since the invasion of 2022. Now, Russia is losing territory in Bakhmut, Herbst said, referring to counterattacks from Kyiv into the small industrial city where Russian and Ukrainian forces have clashed since last summer. There has been no real Russian counterattack this year, and Ukraine is preparing for another. Moscow was even worse then. A year ago, analysts overestimated Russia's power, added Herbst. Herbst's comments come as the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said more than 200,000 Russian troops have been liquidated in the conflict so far. According to the Ukrainian military, Moscow has lost 610 soldiers in the past 24 hours. Russia does not regularly publish casualty figures. In January, Moscow said less than 6,000 of its soldiers had been killed, along with less than 4,000 additional fighters from the so-called Russian People's Republics in the Ukrainian-invaded Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The casualty figure has not been independently verified by Newsweek. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Foreign Ministry for comment. 8. How Russia lost 200,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Newsweek ran an article titled, "How Russia Lost 200,000 Soldiers in Ukraine," meaning, how Russia lost 200,000 soldiers in Ukraine. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through the presentation of Thao Lai. More than 200,000 Russian troops were liquidated during the all-out invasion of Ukraine launched by President Vladimir Putin nearly 15 months ago, according to figures released by the Kyiv military. As part of a daily update on the war, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine publishes data on the losses of Russian troops and equipment, according to which Moscow has lost 610 soldiers in 24 hours. over the past hour, according to Wednesday's casualty figures, bringing the total to 200,590. While casualty estimates vary, and Ukraine's numbers often outnumber those of its Western allies, analysts told Newsweek that Russian losses are increasingly affecting its ability to the country's combat effectiveness. One said poorly trained recruits, many of them from ethnic areas other than Russian, are often seen as cannon fodder. The toll continues to rise ahead of an anticipated counteroffensive from Ukraine to recapture temporarily occupied territories, and the bloody battle for the industrial city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine that is intensifying with the counterattack from Kiev. Russia itself rarely publishes numbers on casualties, but when it does, its estimates are much lower than those of Ukraine. In September 2022, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that 5,937 Russian soldiers had been killed in the conflict in Ukraine since February 24, 2022. This is the second time that Russia has released figures of casualties in the conflict. War. Estimates from Ukraine's Western allies also tend to be more conservative than those from Ukraine, although much higher than those given by Russia. In early May, the U.S. National Security Council said Russia had suffered 100,000 casualties, including 20,000 deaths, since December alone. This is in line with General's November 2022 estimate. Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, about 100,000 casualties in the first 8 months of the invasion. A U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment leaked in April found that Russia suffered a total of 189,500 to 223,000 casualties, including 35,500 to 43,000 dead and 154,000 to 180,000 wounded. The casualty figure has not been independently verified by Newsweek. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Defense Ministry for comment. Russia has lost a generation of officers. Pavel Luzin, a Russian political analyst and visiting scholar at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, told Newsweek, despite all estimates, the damage is terrible. Luzin said that such massive casualties damaged the organizational integrity of the Russian armed forces. Russia lost not only soldiers but also many officers on the Ukrainian battlefield. Russia has lost a generation of officers, especially if we talk about the lowest-ranking officers like lieutenants and captains, added Luzin. The most professional units were lost, and most of them were lost in the first 6 months of the war. The BBC's Russian service reported in September 2022, citing publicly available data, that Russia had lost more than 900 Special Forces soldiers, paratroopers, Marines, and pilots over the 6-month invasion of Ukraine. Putin's comprehensive. That number includes 151 soldiers from Russian military intelligence, 337 Marines, 245 soldiers from the Special Forces of the National Guard and Riot Police, and 144 members of the units. Elite paratroopers, 20 members of the Federal Security Service, or FSB, and the Federal Guard Service, or FSO, as well as at least 67 fighter pilots. Poor leadership. Luzin said poor leadership in Kremlin was part of the cause of the death toll, noting that Russian military commanders played only a small role in the planning process for the war. The main role is played by the intelligence officers around Vladimir Putin, by the people of the FSB, etc. They believe that they need the Russian armed forces just for fire support. They believe they have the situation under control in Ukraine, he said. But the reality turned out to be very different from what the Russian armed forces were expecting, Luzin said. The military leadership commanders were not prepared for this. And that's why they lost a lot of elite troops. It is a paradox that Russia is not prepared for war militarily, technically, in terms of human training, etc. But at the same time, the Russian Federation cannot be better prepared than at the beginning of 2022. The army is poorly trained. According to military analysts from the Conflict Intelligence Team, or CIT for short, Putin captured soldiers for his war largely from Russia's republics, including Dagestan in the Caucasus, Yakutia in northeastern Siberia, Buryatia near the border of Mongolia and Krasnoyarsk. Mark Voiger, a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA for short, and a professor at the U.S. University of Kiev, told Newsweek that most Russian casualties are likely from these regions. Voiger, a former special advisor on Russian and Eurasian affairs to General Ben Hodges when he was commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, said, in addition to the elite forces sent to the meat grinder right away. From the beginning, most of the cannonballs come from impoverished or non-Russian ethnic minority areas. Vladimir Butev of the Free Buryatia Foundation, a pro-democracy group based in the United States, previously told Newsweek that Russia's explicit attack on ethnic minorities during the conflict would backfire. Putin's war efforts. Budev explained that many people in these regions were given summons soon after Putin announced partial mobilization in September 2022, despite not meeting the criteria set by Russian defense officials, such as must have relevant experience. Voyager also points to a months-long recruitment operation by Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, a paramilitary unit heavily involved in the wars in Bakhmut, along with ordinary soldiers, to recruit a prisoner and other unpopular for the war. Prigozhin is offering reduced sentences for male prisoners and cash incentives in exchange for 6 months of military service in Ukraine. A 48-year-old former Russian prisoner hired by the Wagner Corporation told the Wall Street Journal he only trained for 3 weeks and barely survived the first assignment. Meanwhile, more reports emerged of men ineligible to be called up for military service. In October 2022, a Moscow government official who enlisted under Putin's mobilization orders, despite having no combat experience, was killed in Ukraine. Some enlisted Russians died before reaching the battlefield, while others died shortly after being deployed in Ukraine. Lack of equipment, ammunition. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov in October 2022 acknowledged Russia's lack of equipment for soldiers in war, and announced the creation of a council set up by Putin to deal with those problems. Alexander Stupin, spokesman for the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, said that same month, Putin's troops were struggling to obtain equipment and armor. Just a few weeks earlier, it became clear that Russia had begun to use Soviet-era stockpile systems, such as the T-62 tank, the Grad rocket launcher, the Tu-S-7 Pion self-propelled howitzer, and the armored personnel carrier. MTLB troops. More recently, Prigozhin launched harsh verbal attacks against Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov for the apparent lack of ammunition for his fighters during the battle for Bakhmut. Mikhail Vinogradov, founder and president of the St. Petersburg, said Russia's lack of equipment for war could be because the Russian armed forces were not prepared for such a large-scale and protracted conflict. Despite the growing losses in the Russian military, Voyager told Newsweek he believes Putin will continue to launch attacks, even though at this stage he lacks the numbers to overwhelm Ukraine. What about Ukrainian casualties? Like Russia, Ukraine has largely avoided publishing casualty figures for its forces. However, the number of Ukrainian casualties is also significant, according to Western intelligence estimates. A U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment leaked in April estimated that Ukraine suffered 124,500 to 131,000 casualties, including 15,500 to 17,500 dead and 109,000 to 113,500 wounded. In November 2022, General Milley said that casualties on both sides at the time exceeded 100,000, in addition to the civilian toll of 40,000.